Welcome to the We Are Lach podcast. I am Chris.
I am Heather.
And I'm Lavinia.
You can find our introduction in the podcast feed and in the show notes to this episode. So before we dive into this topic with you, Lavinia, which is about fashion, I just want to note that we are recording this on October 7th, 2024. So it's been a year since the beginning of this phase of the genocide in Gaza. And to quote Rabbi Brant Rosen, this is a time of genocide. This is a time of genocide. And we know that there have been other genocides in the past, and there is more than one genocide happening right now. And so it can feel very uncomfortable having an episode about a topic like fast fashion in the midst of all this suffering and in the midst of all of this repression and the double standards. But you, Lavinia, you are aware of the deep harm that happens even in the fashion industry, in a place where maybe we don't think about it very much. And it makes sense for us to uncover harm everywhere that most people want to avoid, just as they may wish to be avoiding the news right now. And this past weekend, I was in Bogota, and there were people who were living on the street. And the way that we are taught, conditioned to walk past them, I think speaks a lot to why, if we can do that with someone who's right in front of us, then of course we can do it with people living far away, or in an industry like fashion where we literally don't see the people. You know, we're just wearing clothes and we're like wanting to feel good and we want to look good. And, you know, it's all about that. And that suffering is really hidden. So if we're not able to look at the suffering in front of us, then how are we ever going to be able to look at the suffering that's in a hidden industry?
Yeah, Heather, I'm grateful you said that, because I do agree that it's important for us to highlight that this is a time of genocide, of multiple genocides, and that talking about this, as uncomfortable as it is completely in line with the approach that we hope to take in our podcast. Indeed, a big part of that is what you just said, which is we're conditioned to ignore people who are even right in front of us. And for that reason, I would definitely tie our podcast and the themes of our podcast regarding racism and appropriation, dehumanization, exploitation, and really capitalism at large to genocide. Genocide as the most extreme form, extreme implementation of all of those things that we do talk about in our podcast. So in this episode, our second episode, which is still very experimental, we're going to begin, as you've said, Heather, to highlight some of these connections in the context of the global fashion industry.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, and as we've been doing, we started with you, Chris, last time, talking about the aviation industry. And now, Lavinia, it's your turn. We get to question you. And you're one of the hosts. And so, yeah, I'm excited about this.
Thanks, both of you. Before diving into today's topic, I would also like to highlight that obviously in the occupied territories in Palestine, global fashion is also produced. Specifically in the West Bank, there's a couple of garment factories, ready-made garment factories owned by Israelis. And they are producing for sportswear brands like Puma and Adidas, PVH Corp, and so on and so forth. And as we can imagine, not only the fashion industry, but all consumer goods industries, everything is interconnected. And working conditions in occupied territories where Palestinians do not have the same rights, and obviously not the same workers' rights, are super detrimental. And this is a topic which is often left out of the whole conversation regarding working conditions in the global south. You know, we mostly talk about the MENA region, like North African countries producing fashion for Western countries, Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. But yeah, there's also luxury and urban fashion goods produced in the occupied territories under awful conditions.
Lavinia, I'm really grateful that you shared what you just shared, because, and I will confess, this is certainly not something that I was aware of. And perhaps it's maybe something I could have uncovered if I were looking. But I believe a great function of this podcast is to share things with our audience and really with each other that we wouldn't even know where to begin to look for. And we are talking today in this episode about fashion, and particularly about greenwashing in fashion. But I want to emphasize to our listeners that when we talk about greenwashing, it's not just about carbon dioxide emissions or the use of water, wastewater, fibers, synthetic versus natural. We're talking really about human lives. We're talking about the people who are not just invisible just because, but they are invisible because there are forces, there are institutions, there are other people who have invisibilized and dehumanized them. And so I really want to hear from you more about some of these hidden sides of quote unquote greenwashing. Perhaps even the word greenwashing is not the most ideal word to really capture all of those elements. But I think for simplicity, just for the sake of opening the conversation, could you talk about what sparked your focus on these more hidden sides of greenwashing that we will begin to get into in today's episode?
Yeah, I would love to. I think greenwashing is an okay umbrella term, but within my work in like dissecting different layers of greenwashing, not only in the fashion industry, also in other sectors, I believe that my focus really comes from the frustration with how sustainability is often simplified, or always simplified, we might even say, right? I think we've been conditioned to think that greenwashing only means misleading environmental claims. That's where the term and the definition comes from. Like in the fashion world, like a brand saying they use organic cotton, you know, while still harming the planet elsewhere. But greenwashing goes so much deeper. There's social washing, where companies give the illusion of caring about workers' rights. Then there's what I call global south shaming, where Western brands essentially push all the blame for exploitation onto the countries where they outsource production. And I think this term, let's call it a term, global south shaming, is really, really interesting. And I do believe we need to, or it's very necessary to dissect it. It's this situation or this narrative when companies frame the issues of labor exploitation or environmental damage as being entirely the fault of countries, of mismanaged countries like Bangladesh, China, or Vietnam, as if these problems are unique to those places. Totally ignoring the interconnected realities of the multiple crises, and specifically the environmental and, well, the crisis of humanity we are in. And one of the realities is that, well, the entire system of production, not only fashion production, is built to exploit cheaper labor in the global south. But Western brands and consumers drive that demand, right? So by scapegoating the global south, these companies ignore their own complicity and their role in perpetuating harm. And yeah, I believe it's colonial mindset, blame the producers while the real power structures remain untouched.
Yeah, thanks, Lavinia. I mean, as a consumer, I have known for a long time how bad things are. And I spent 17 years in the UK, where they have a really a strong culture of charity shops, where every high street has several charity shops so that you can get used clothing really cheaply. So there are lots of people like me, when I lived there, that would go to these shops to avoided buying new clothes. We just never had to buy new clothes. You just get it there, and it's cheaper, and it feels like you're doing something good. But I have a feeling, and I think I've heard, that this isn't a way to absolve what's happening, where clothes end up, etc. Maybe you can speak to that. And then I'd also be curious to know, what are we supposed to do for clothes, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, there's obviously no right or wrong answer. What I can tell you is that purchasing clothing from charity shops is not the solution to overproduction, nor, to the multifaceted problems, in global garment and textile supply chains. But it really depends on the place where all of this is happening and the regional infrastructure of waste management. So it gets really, really, really complex. I think the UK is a very specific place because, well, for a couple of different reasons of missing social infrastructure, the charity sector is very, very big in the UK, right? In Germany, this is a little different. In France, it's different. I actually don't know how all of this is managed and or mismanaged, sorry, in the US. I think, first of all, if folks donate their clothes because they do not use it anymore, it's totally appropriate, right? Instead of discarding it. And then in case the infrastructure behind it is mostly and majorly managed by civil society organizations, there is a social infrastructure of creating jobs, of, giving new value to the items and so on and so forth. That is also good and might even be one of the partial solutions to, reusing and scaling up. Oh my gosh, I'm using the word scaling up. I don't want to use the word scaling up, but helping, the circular economy. Let's put it like that. The problem nowadays is that big retailers have realized that it's very good money. The secondhand clothing market is very good money. And basically, the civil society organizations over the last 30 to 40 years globally in the West have, implemented an infrastructure of a kind of reverse supply chain and donations. And this is right now being destroyed. by the Marks and Spencers of the world, by the Zalandos of the world, because they are introducing resale shops and so on and so forth. And at least I can say that about Germany, the whole infrastructure of donating clothes to charity, and the whole social infrastructure, which goes along with this, because the sorting facilities are mostly entities where disabled people work, so it's part of the social infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And this is being destroyed for the sake of, or it's at least sold by the big retailers, secondhand, giving a new value to clothes as a solution to, the sustainability crises, and a solution for the circular economy. And I think I'm going to stop here because it's such a complex topic. We did not yet even touch, the fact how much of the clothing is sent, to global south countries via free trade zones, like neoliberal ideas come in, and it's getting much more nasty if we take a deeper look at this.
So, Lavinia, do you want to maybe touch a little bit on what you just talked about, which is the role of global South countries in this system, this flows of materials and financial capital? Could you maybe elaborate on it just a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, we live in this globalized world, right? But at the end of the day, as I said in the introduction, fashion has always been tied to colonialism, right? Whether it was in the past and today exploiting resources or appropriating cultural symbols, the industry grew from these power imbalances. And today the same power dynamics persist. And coming back to our topic, greenwashing is a tool of that system. And I think by framing sustainability issues as something that's happening over there, in the global south, where most of our clothing is produced, companies get to maintain, this illusion that Western consumers and brands are the solution to the problems we created. Funnily. Really, it's just another way of maintaining control, making it seem like, the global south is the problem, rather than looking at how global capitalism creates and sustains these injustices. I do have a little bit of hope, because a couple of big producing countries are getting empowered, are growing economically, and at least, like from my experience, it is different now. Whenever, for example, I am in India and I'm collaborating and working with a supplier, the situation changed. They tend to tell me, and I obviously welcome this, no, this is not possible. We are going to do it this way. You are not going to tell us how to do it. This is what is possible, and so on and so forth. So there is a little, like, I personally do have a little hope, but When
I look at some places in the global south, and I live in the global south, I live in Colombia, but so I guess I can just speak from this, but I also see it on the television that there are people wearing very Western clothes, like T-shirts with brand, like New York or, something. How are these, educate me here. How are these things ending up in those places? Is it because they might have been made there and then they're sold there? Or is it because someone is selling it to them? And what about places where we're made to believe that there's no money, like there's like a humanitarian crisis, people can't afford to go there's no malls or, you know, like where are people getting Western clothes from? Like, how does it work?
Through all streams which do exist. You know, they are manufactured there. The big fashion companies do have license factories everywhere, like the big ones. There are cut make trim facilities in Colombia of Adidas and so on and so forth. Garments are produced everywhere in the world. And in some cases, they come, you know, as secondhand clothing. Yeah, both, everything. But it's also like, I mean, it's the predominant, you know, style of clothing, you know, and it's warped all over the world. And yeah.
What is that supply chain, going back to my experience in the UK, of if they can't sell, you know, like they put dates on each item of clothing, you know,
They do?
for the charity
but that's good.
shops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they're not going to be sold, then people, you know, it goes off the racks. And I don't know if it goes, I think there might be a process of let's try the next town, and it might like rotate a bit like that. But they also get so much. They get so many donations because, again, it's like soothing people's consciousness to be like, well, I want to go buy some new clothes, but at least these clothes, you know, someone will buy them who couldn't afford clothes or is trying to be environmentally sustainable. And so now they're not going to buy new clothes. But there is so much. And there's not enough people buying from charity shops. So where do those clothes go?
I don't think it's entirely correct what you said with regard to this. I mean, yes, we are like, there's clothes everywhere. And basically, there are statistics which say, like right now, 2024, we have so many items of clothes in the world, like we could just stop producing for 6 years and, you know, all of the inhabitants of this world, you know, would have enough, you know, to put on their bodies, right? But what I'm seeing over here in Europe with this new growth mindset and the new business case of secondhand clothing, it's actually that the civil society and charity shops do not have enough clothes right now and not in proper qualities to actually sell it to maintain their civil society charity businesses. That's actually happening right now, actually since the pandemic, because basically the so-called reverse supply chains in the beginning of the pandemic, you know, everybody cleaned their houses and like we all donated clothes, sorry. And then there was just too much in order to sort and, you know, manage all of this. And since approximately 2.5 years, the big retailers of the world are buying for very cheap money the secondhand clothing and reselling it, you know, with margins, you know, making their shareholders happy. And the charity shops are actually struggling. And whatever is not sold over here in the West, it depends a little bit on the country because waste is perceived differently in different countries. But the donations are classified. And they are very, very, at least over here in Germany, they are very racist terms for the classification of used clothes. So over here in Germany, we have like the gray items, the gray or beige items. They mostly go to Eastern Europe and they are donated, you know, to orphanages, to regions, you know, where used clothes are needed. And then there's another term over here in Germany, which is called, it's just called Africa. And that's the lowest quality stuff, which is then sent and donated to Ghana, Kenya, and so on and so forth. And everything what is not sold, either here in Europe, obviously ends up in a landfill and is destroyed, or ends up in the global south and is either reused or, in the best case scenario, upcycled and or downcycled. There is some stuff which is downcycled to how do you say this, colchones. There is stuff which is recycled to mattresses. Do you call it?
Mattresses.
Mattresses. Okay. There is unused secondhand clothing of very poor quality, which is downcycled to mattresses and stuff like that. But there's still a lot of clothing which ends up in landfill. And we have global data, but it's very old and it's not accurate. So I'm not going to drop any numbers here.
I'm stuck, Lavinia, on what you just said earlier about the world having enough clothes for 6 years. And it makes me think of, in the context of markets and market forces, in the very broad terms, because we're not getting into things like subsidies, etc. But in the very broad terms of market forces, it makes me even ask the question, in this particular market, globalized fashion market, who are the real customers then? Right? It almost seems like, from the perspective of customers, or in the most broad sense, this question of demand, it then becomes essential to meet margins and keep the shareholders happy, to produce demand through any means necessary to keep people buying so that these companies can stay in business. And I think the word fashion, when I hear the word fashion, I think of something that is intended to be used for a season, and then maybe the word discarded has too much weight to it, but put away wherever away is, to make room for the next season. But there are other things that I try to bring to my mind in terms of this word fashion, where we as a species, for tens, hundreds of thousands of years, have been wearing clothing, not just out of necessity, but as a way of expressing ourselves. So in that sense, if the word fashion is an umbrella term for cultural expression through the things that we put on our bodies, then we can say fashion has existed since long before European colonization. It's existed since long before capitalism and the corporation. So perhaps I'm going a little bit here and there and to and fro, but I'm trying to grapple with these things that are sitting in my head at the same time. This idea of clothing as cultural expression, this idea of the world having enough clothing, and this idea that because the world has enough clothing to put on our bodies, then there is a demand engine that needs to be primed and fueled and amplified by businesses that rely on the sales, the continual sales of clothing items from one season to the next. So I don't know if there's a way for the two of you to sort through all the stuff that I'm putting out there, but I'm wondering, is there anything that comes to your mind in what I'm saying around these different elements that in my mind appear to be connected in some way?
Yeah. Well, I think everything is connected. And I think in the deeper sense, fashion is, and eventually should be, I don't know, about cultural expression. I don't think when we talk about like Western urban clothing, like the clothing which is overproduced, right? in our world right now. I don't think we can talk about cultural expression, but it's also like my personal opinion, and I don't have a lot of emotions when it comes to Western clothing. I think it's highly boring. How we dress. I also know that we are producing in the same way as we produced, with almost the same machinery, like some buttons have changed, right? And almost the same fabrics, except, well, since the 40s, more or less, fossil fuel fibers and materials were added. So, this whole idea around culture, I think it's a huge conversation, and it would change everything. How we perceive fashion and so on and so forth. But I would also like to highlight that also pre-colonial times, clothing, even in feudalism, I can only talk about Europe because this is unfortunately more or less the only history I studied, or I was made to study. Clothing since many thousand years has been very classist and restricted, depending on your caste, depending on your job, depending on your gender, depending on your religion, and so on and so forth. So I think we are opening, a sphere over here, which is huge, right? And then on the other hand, I also see clothing in uniforms. And then there's I'm only demonstrating two layers right now, right? So there's the military kind of uniform, which when I think about this, it doesn't feel good. And then there's the kind of uniform where you belong to an eventual caring community. Right. So yeah, I think there's so many layers to it. But what bothers me personally is the sheer amount of boring, same style clothing which is circulating the world.
Yeah. I bet I'll say this more than once in this podcast series, but I really find it so tragic how I can be in the middle of Poland and see a Kentucky Fried Chicken on one side of the road and a Burger King on the other side and say, guess where I am? But not only that, it's the houses, the cars, the restaurants, the hotels, the malls, the way people are dressing, how people say things, and it's a monoculture. It's so disgusting because you just think we are incredible human beings with this incredible capacity for creativity and innovation. And it's not through the fault of the people in general that this has happened. Even the weapons being used, if you're going to have war, the weapons being used are the same all over the world. So you just think something has happened, and, we call it colonization and all of that. But certain companies, certain rich people, are able to really destroy culture, where we're just left with one culture. It's so unusual to look. I mean, here I can look on the news in Colombia and see reports in indigenous areas around the country where people are wearing their traditional clothing, But the indigenous people that live here in my town are displaced. And they've been brought in from hot regions to come to this cold place to work in the flower industry. And they're dressed in jeans and t-shirts, and it is just so sad to see all over the world this monoculture, and to think about how it came to be and how rich those people and industries are for it. Like Coca-Cola everywhere, so it's not just that, it's the food. They sell pizza here. Imagine if it was like, I have to go to Italy to have pizza. I'm not even entirely sure that pizza is the invention of Italy. Like chicken tikka masala is not. It's from Scotland or something, or England. Anyway, but like, there's not a whole lot that is special, like when you travel, because the monoculture, there's enough difference where people want to travel. But imagine, like I like to imagine, what would it be like to live here in this market town in Colombia if they hadn't been influenced by the West? How would people live in, like how would people live together? How would they have shelter? How would they eat and eat together? What would they dress like? Like, sky's the limit. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, there are many thoughts that come to my mind at the moment. And actually, you called out food even as I was thinking about it, because I thought to myself, corn used to come in different colors. I mean, you go to an American grocery store and it's mostly yellow corn, and it's mostly brown potatoes, and red tomatoes of a certain shape. So one of many reasons why I really like talking to the two of you is that we both, all three of us have the desire to uncover how the world came to be and what were the forces that made that happen. And not just in some generic terms of power and systems, but specific institutions, specific people. This idea that the world of today just sort of happened on its own, I don't accept that. I accept that there are systems and that systems have feedback loops and there are dynamics. This I agree with 100%. But I also believe the systems of today were established with certain intentions, certain decisions by entities, some of which were very, very powerful. I will say this, one of the things that I grapple with that I don't necessarily have a good answer for is that the number of people on planet Earth is much, much higher now than it was back even 200 years ago. And there's a sentiment that I've seen out there in other people's conversations for many years, something that I also grapple with is, well, how would we feed and clothe all these people, all the billions of people on the planet without capitalism? Right? How would we, how could people afford to live? Billions of people, 7-8 billion people on planet Earth without these huge industries and these global supply chains. And I guess you might say this monoculture, that is to say that the culture we see of today, we're being sold this idea that what we see is actually a result of people expressing themselves. That this is actually what people want. This is the food people want to eat. This is the clothing people want to wear, or else why would people buy it? I'm interested to hear your reactions to this thing that I have in my head.
Yeah. I think people wouldn't need to afford, first of all, to survive and or, to live a good life. I think this idea of affording, outside of capitalism, it doesn't exist or it changes, and then I think, at least what I understood after, being so heavily trained and manipulated by this idea of all size fits one solution thinking in sustainability, is that place dictates strategy. And it depends on the very hyper local region, which crops, hand in hand with the weather conditions, do interconnect and intersect with different crops in order to, regenerate the soils and so on and so forth. And the same applies, obviously, to produce clothing and or eventually, based on natural fibers, right? So where I come from Germany, cotton is a desert crop. So there has never been cotton, grown in Germany or in the north of Europe. It was linen and hemp, and as well, we live in cold weather. It was mostly wool, right? We were using. So all of this would change.
Yeah, and like we'd have 6 years to work it out because there's enough clothes to last for 6 years, for one thing. And yeah, definitely the taking the profit motive out of it, like would change so much. And so there's, thought experiments that we could do where it's like, if suddenly something happened and we got rid of capitalism, how would we clothe ourselves? And number one, we'd want to distribute all of those 6 years worth of clothes around the world, which might be a bit more confusing now with extreme weather. So places where you thought they don't need winter coats, they do now, like in Kenya, or places where they didn't think it would get too cold. Too hot. Now they need to like have more clothing like that. Yeah. So redistribution, in a loving, caring, mutual aid way. But we're not going to, like, that thought experiment is not going to happen. Like, I guess the closest maybe we could get to it is through collapse of the global supply chain, through like how Panama, like when there's more droughts now, and so the Panama Canal can't have ships. And then how are they supposed to get clothing, but also medicine and all kinds of things to people? So I suppose we could think in terms of, there's been a dock workers strike in the US, and, you could think, well, what, or the Houthis, like shooting at Israeli allies, with their container ships and things like that. So you could think, well, that kind of disruption, what would we do? And yes, so there might then be enough clothes around in the system, to last for that kind of thing. But yeah, like you were saying, Lavinia, what would happen after the 6 years and people still need clothes? I think there'd be a long period of like, yeah, I guess it would be not necessarily upcycling, but just a recycling, like repairing of clothing and combining clothes together and not really caring so much what, like the idea of fashion and style would really change, and people could get more creative with what they put together and how they, they might decorate their clothing in a certain way, and, just people's creativity, might come out in that way. But I think that just because you take away the profit motive, same with medicine, it doesn't mean that no one will be willing to provide people with things that they need without a profit motive. And that's like a real lie that they've sold to us, I'd rather have doctors who are doing it because they care about my health rather than because it was a lucrative profession to go into. I'd rather trust a pharmaceutical company that wasn't in it for the profit. Like, I want to know that they, are working on prevention stuff more than working on, like the medicine, because what they're doing is what makes sense for the health of people rather than how are they going to make the most money. So I really like, my hope is in the sense of, I believe people do care about each other, really, and that we would see people who need clothing and figure out how to clothe them, see people who are suffering from illness, etc., and want to find, you hear children around the world saying, "Oh, I want to grow up and, find a cure for something." Like, they're not saying, "I want to grow up and make the most money I can, and so I'm trying to figure out, like, should I be a YouTube influencer or, whatever." You see, really deep down, people want a meaningful way to contribute to life on the planet.
Yeah, I really like the different things you've said, multiple things, Heather, that really bring some thoughts to my mind. One of which is, as you began with, this idea of thoughts, thought exercises, and where you went with that, you just wrapped by talking about children and children's dreams. I was speaking to a business coach just last week or the week before, and she said something that I've been trying to grasp and still working on grasping not very well. This idea of what does it mean to be playful? And of course, she was speaking in the context of business, but I feel like I'm seeing something, combining this idea of thought exercises and of visions and dreaming and of playfulness and of children thinking about their own futures, not in terms of wanting to make the most money, but wanting to express themselves in a different way. And we've been talking today about self-expression in its various manifestations. I like the idea of envisioning the world in different ways. And I suppose there's not necessarily a playfulness in envisioning the various ways that the world could collapse in the next couple of years, but there is a playfulness, I like to believe, there's a playfulness we can capture in thinking of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be together? What does it mean to be ourselves together in the times that we're living in? And if certain doors were to close, what doors would open, given the nature of our species? And I agree with you, Heather. I don't believe that humans are inherently selfish, as certain people might try to convince us. Do we have selfish tendencies? Of course. Do we have in-group versus out-group tendencies? Yes, absolutely, we do. And we can see through the record of human history and through archaeological records of prehistory that humans lived in self-contained groups, fairly small groups that had different ways of life and different culture. We know that war and violence are not a modern invention. They go back throughout our species. But we also know through study of culture, both prehistorical and historical, that humans are not just selfish, that they're not just violent, that they're also creative, they're also supportive, they're also caring and loving, and they also think not just to the next quarter, but to the next 7 generations. We know that through archaeology and through written records. So it's this strange period in time for me, because when I think of the history of our species, I think of the 400, 500, 600 years of European colonization, the few hundred years of global capitalism and corporations, it's just a tiny little piece of our history. And I'm really starting to believe that there's a world before capitalism, there's a world during capitalism, and there's a world after capitalism. And I don't want to romanticize collapse in any way. And we are seeing, as we began with this episode by talking about being in a time of genocide, we are seeing not only how extreme things can get, but also how easy it is for so many people to ignore the things that happen and how bad things can go. So I don't want to romanticize collapse, but somehow in this whole mix, I'm trying to grasp this idea of what does it mean to be who we are, even in a time like this, even in especially this idea of even these times are perhaps not nearly as bad as things can get. And I'm wondering if the two of you might have thoughts in response to this, particularly in the context of fashion. But of course, I think for a while now in today's podcast, we've been talking well beyond the bounds of just things that we put on our bodies that are made of cotton or linen or rayon or hemp. I'm just interested to hear how you would respond.
I hear you. I feel you. I have mixed feelings. First of all, like coming back to greenwashing and the different layers, I hope I pronounce it properly in English. Green whining. It's a new term which is coming up, especially in social media. So there's basically a movement of ignorance with regard to societal collapse, where folks are performing and celebrating, like eventually, in our opinion, like toxic behaviors like overconsumption and drug abuse and consuming more and more and more and more fashion. So this is the thing on the internet nowadays, and it's growing. This movement is growing. Okay. Although, I live in my bubble. I think everybody, at least, in my circle is more or less aware of the fact of, well, fast fashion is bad. We are, buying too much, blah, 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 blah. Then on the other hand, on TikTok, there's a trend, which I'm observing since approximately 5 to 6 months, which is interesting, by a couple of Gen Z. Well, not a couple, millions of Gen Z influencers who are having like a battle on underconsumption of fashion. This is also interesting. But I think this also shows like, well, first of all, the complexity and like the many, many, many layers. And I think this is important, like that we keep on watching out, observing, like the pluriversal, multiversal dynamics which do exist and which do evolve, right? And obviously, like we were talking about, well, if we would stop producing clothes right now, we would have clothes for 6 years. Well, there's obviously a handful, many millions of people's jobs rely, on cultivation of fibers and in global supply chains. It would be a big effort, right, to organize all of this. And then there's obviously like, I do perceive this as like a very, like Eurocentric single solution, because like I am the one who's like totally okay with right now stop consuming because I've consumed all my life, right? But then there's consumer markets in China and India, I'm not going to tell them to stop, shopping clothes if they, want to do this. So I think lots to unpack here. Heather.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I never heard of green whining. Gosh, there's always new words to learn, aren't there? Yeah, I guess starting to close this up here, and thinking about, how we wouldn't impose, like the whole job thing. Like, of course, my vision, I'm a communitarian anarchist, and you might hear more about that in the next episode. But I, don't want us to have jobs either, Like, I just want us to live and meet each other's needs, which will include things like clothing and food, but also our need for doing meaningful things, like I said, our need for community and all of that. So yeah, bringing us back towards the top of the episode and not wanting to look at suffering, and everything is so globalized, these systems, and who's doing the jobs, who's growing the materials for the clothes and everything. And we didn't even touch iPhones and genocide around that. Yeah, I guess like what you were saying, Chris, about how, what came up for me when you were talking was how we really need to take time with each other to feel what is happening in the world and not just walk by people on the street without really grappling with, this person isn't just a statistic. This person is someone with needs, and they are sleeping on the street while hundreds of tourists walk by. And then we can come home and turn on the TV and watch reports about what's been happening the past year, and all those messages we're getting. And I mentioned lies earlier, and we do hear lies now, like excuses and the dehumanization of people. They become statistics. Certain people, they deserve to have their names read out and their photos up, and other people don't. And so there's nothing super wise to say here other than it's all devastating. And yet, my hope in this is seeing more and more people becoming radicalized by the double standards. We just had Hurricane Elaine in the United States, and of course, it gets more coverage than. Well, it's not even getting that much coverage, but it gets more than you would get in Bangladesh or something. But still, I've been listening to the stories there, and who is coming to save us? It's not industry leaders, it's not governments. We only have each other, and that requires like us being very deliberate around like resisting the dehumanization of our fellow humans. But thank you, Lavinia, so much for sharing all this and teaching us about green whining and all sorts of things around the supply chain. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciated and I said this before, but I'll just say it again, maybe in a different way. One of the reasons why I really enjoy our conversations, the three of us, is we start with, it's almost like a little crystal that is a topic, the topic we announce at the beginning of the episode. And then in the act of talking, we see naturally all the different interconnections. I mean, perhaps it's even a cliche. Well, it is a cliche. Everything is connected. But in speaking about it, I feel like the three of us naturally uncover all those different connections. And we also uncover and acknowledge how there's so much more we could say. and how there's so many more interconnections that we could uncover. And just today, in the limited time that we've spoken, we started with genocide, and we talked about fashion, we talked about the global north and south, about capitalism, we talked about fashion materials, we talked about food, we talked about cultural expression, anthropology and archaeology and history and prehistory. And I'm grateful for that. In a way, even though we were talking about the darkness of times, it's almost like our own little way of being playful and being joyful with one another. And I'm just grateful for that. So I really appreciate the two of you for conversations like this.
Yeah, thank you both, Heather and Chris. Yeah, that was a wild episode. And I'm trying to sum it up and bring it in line with the day we are recording. I think greenwashing takes the form of temporary solutions that don't address structural inequalities. I think this is one of the easiest and most direct definitions. And I believe everybody here in the room, we request a ceasefire now, right? And no temporary solution now. And then I think also tech companies and even arms companies, and big oil are talking about reducing carbon footprints, but behind the scenes, and not even behind the scenes, in front of our eyes, they are producing and dropping bombs, which are like environmental catastrophes, So across sectors and specifically military, or everything what has to do with the military, greenwashing is a tool to maintain the illusion of progress in the most violent way there is. So, free Palestine.
Yes, Lavinia, thank you. And as we say goodbye, I am in the hot seat next time talking about higher education, but I'd also like to give a shout out to my friend Alex in Wonderland, who literally isn't in Wonderland, although maybe, he lives in his old world, maybe, but it's in London, in England. And for the theme song, Climb Aboard, which there's a link to it in the show notes. And so thank you, everybody.
Yes, and thank you to our listeners. Please be in touch with us if you have any comments or other suggestions for future topics. As you can see, we take all topics and weave very big and experimental conversations with them.
Yes. Bye. Bye, fellow Lachs.
Bye-bye.